Today, three separate federal judges started raining on his parade, a quick succession of court decisions over the course of just a few hours rebuking Trump on some of his seemingly highest priorities in office. I mean, these are the things that keep him up at night. These are the things he thinks about, that he plots about, that he talks about to the press and anyone who's listening. There is clear evidence of the growing backlash to his profiteering off of his petition.
Okay, pause on that for a second. Three judges, one afternoon. Not one, three. And we're not talking about procedural delays or technicalities being argued over scheduling conflicts. We're talking about rulings that cut directly into things he has been building, quietly, for months, maybe longer. Now here's what I want you to understand before we go any further. Because the way this story is being told in most places flattens it. It makes it sound like a rough news cycle, a bad Tuesday. It's not. What happened in those few hours is something that, when you actually understand what was being attempted here, is genuinely hard to believe. So let's actually build this properly, from the beginning. Because one of these rulings is, in my view, one of the most stunning legal moments of this entire era, and it's getting buried underneath the other two. So we're going to give it the space it deserves. But first, let's set the stage. Because the backdrop to all of this? Almost too on the nose. Trump's 81st birthday is 2 weeks away. And in the lead-up, there's been a cage fight, an actual UFC event, scheduled on the White House lawn. There's his name going up on the Kennedy Center, replacing John F. Kennedy's. There are stock purchases in UFC's parent company, somewhere between $15,000 and $50,000 worth, disclosed just after he'd been publicly promoting the very event that company is hosting on his lawn. The White House says there's no conflict of interest. Right. Look, I'm not going to spend time on the birthday party optics. That's a sideshow. What matters is what was happening in the courts while all of that was being arranged. Because while one hand was organizing the party, the other hand was apparently trying to move $1.8 billion. Let me explain what that actually means. Trump filed a $10 billion lawsuit against the IRS. Now, follow this carefully because the structure of this is the whole point. Trump filed the lawsuit. His administration controls the DOJ. His DOJ then agreed to settle the lawsuit, the one Trump filed, and proposed a $1.8 billion fund as part of that settlement. A fund that, according to reporting, was designed to compensate people who helped him and potentially extend to essentially anyone else in his orbit he wanted to include. So let's just say that plainly. He filed a lawsuit. His own government settled it. His own government agreed he should receive a massive payout. And then that payout was going to be used to pay political allies. Both sides of the table. Same person. And this isn't me saying that. This is what 35 retired federal judges put in a legal brief. 35 people who spent their careers in federal courtrooms, saying the settlement was built on deception. That the court was made the victim of a fraud.
Through the courts. Remember, Trump's DOJ proposed this fund at a settlement to Trump's $10 billion lawsuit against the IRS that Donald Trump controls. And today, the federal judge in Florida, who heard the lawsuit, right, when Trump filed the lawsuit against the IRS, she said she is reopening that lawsuit to investigate grievous allegations.
Did you catch that phrase? Premised on deception. Made the court the victim of a fraud. That language isn't political commentary. That's a federal judge in Florida reading a brief signed by 35 of her colleagues who dedicated decades to the federal legal system, and deciding that the allegations are serious enough that the case needs to be reopened. She reopened it. Now think about what that means for a second. This wasn't just a ruling that said slow down. This was a judge looking at a settlement that the DOJ had already agreed to, a settlement that was supposed to be done, and saying, wait, something about this doesn't add up, and I want to know what. There's a retired federal judge who appeared on MSNBC to explain exactly what she believed had happened, and the way she described it stopped me.
Claim. The problem is that the claim was really, as we said in our papers, a collusion, was a fraud on the court. That the claim was really not a real claim because it was Donald Trump bargaining with himself.
Donald Trump bargaining with himself. That's what she called it. And once you hear it described that way, you can't unhear it. Think about every lawsuit you've ever heard of in your entire life. The entire point of a lawsuit, the foundational logic of the legal system, is that there are two sides, two genuinely opposing parties, an actual controversy between people who actually disagree about something. What's allegedly being described here is a lawsuit where the plaintiff and the defendant are effectively the same person, operating through different institutional masks. Trump suing, Trump settling with himself, and then the settlement routing money to people he wanted to pay. And the reason this matters beyond the money, beyond the $1.8 billion, is the other thing they allegedly tried to slip in. Because according to Congressman Jamie Raskin, who appeared on this same broadcast, there was something buried in the language of the settlement that went far beyond the payout, a wipeout of liability, not just for Trump personally, for his family, for his businesses, for anything, tax fraud, other federal matters, that might exist in that universe, regardless of whether it had anything to do with the original lawsuit about an IRS leak. In other words, sue the IRS, settle with yourself, collect $1.8 billion, and while no one's looking, also get a blanket legal immunity for your entire financial history. Slip it in. Hope the judge doesn't notice. The judge noticed.
Private government contractor. They knew it. They won on that point, and then they turned around in this case, and they agreed with Donald Trump that he should get $10 billion.
Yes, right.
Yeah. So now they're all going back and saying it was a fraud on the court from the beginning. There was collusion between the two sides.
Let's just sit with that for a second. The DOJ argued, successfully, in a prior case that you can't recover damages from the government for a leak like this. They made that argument. They won on it. The legal precedent existed. And then, in this case, the same DOJ turned around and agreed that Trump was owed $10 billion for exactly the same type of claim. The same argument, the opposite conclusion. Because the person on the other side of the table this time was their boss. And now the courts are going back through it and asking, how did this happen? Here's what I think matters most about where we are right now. And this is the part of the story I don't want you to miss in all the noise of a four-ruling day. When a court says there may have been a fraud on the court itself, that's a categorically different thing than political criticism. Critics can be dismissed. Opponents can be labeled. But when sitting judges and retired judges start using language like premised on deception and fraud on the court and collusion, that's the system pushing back in the most formal, institutionally serious way it knows how. And it's not just one judge. The Virginia judge halted the $1.8 billion fund entirely while lawsuits against the DOJ work through the system. The Florida judge reopened the underlying case. And separately, on the same afternoon, a federal judge in Washington ruled that Trump cannot simply dismiss the indictments of the Oath Keepers who plotted the Capitol attack without presenting actual evidence and facts to justify it. 3 rulings in one afternoon, a fourth before the broadcast ended. And Congressman Raskin, when asked about the significance, put it in terms that I think actually capture what's happening beneath the surface of the daily news cycle. He said, "The constitutional philosophy of no kings is being taken up by the federal judiciary, not as a slogan, as an operating principle. Now, here's the question I keep turning over, and I want to know what you think, so drop it in the comments. How much of this was calculated risk, and how much of it was someone genuinely believing that the courts wouldn't push back? Because the Kennedy Center name change? That's not subtle. Removing JFK's name from a national cultural institution and replacing it with your own, that's not a quiet move. A federal judge today said Congress named that building, and only Congress can rename it. Full stop. Name comes down. The slush fund? Not subtle either. Members of both parties, not just Democrats, have introduced bills to block it. A congressman is pushing to subpoena the Trump officials who designed the plan. The IRS settlement? 35 retired federal judges don't sign on to a brief lightly. That's not a group of people who woke up one morning and decided to make a political statement. Those are people who spent their careers as the referees. And they looked at this and said, something is wrong here, and the court deserves to know. So what does it mean when the people who built and served the system start raising their hands and saying, this isn't how any of this is supposed to work? Here's my read, and I know some of you will push back on this, and that's fine. There's a version of large-scale institutional confidence that starts to look, from the outside, like it becomes its own vulnerability. When someone moves through systems at high speed, with high volume, on multiple fronts simultaneously, they're counting on the velocity itself to prevent any single thing from being examined too closely. And for a long time that works. Until it doesn't. Until a judge in Virginia says, halt. Until a judge in Florida says, reopen. Until a judge in D.C. says, not without evidence. Until a judge over a building says, Congress named it, not you. all in one afternoon.
Leak in the first place. So they tried to sneak into this whole thing, this wipeout of liability, a super pardon by the attorney general for the president, his family, and his businesses. And now suddenly it's clear the emperor's got no clothes. This was a fraud on the court that they're trying to turn into a fraud against the country.
A fraud against the country. That's where Congressman Raskin landed. Not just a fraud on a court, a fraud against the country, using the machinery of the legal system, the weight of settlements, the language of litigation, to accomplish something that normal democratic or legal processes would never allow. And the reason I think that framing matters, beyond the rhetoric of it, is this. If the courts are the last structural check with real teeth in this moment, then today was a day when those teeth showed up. 4 times, in a matter of hours. The question that nobody can fully answer yet, and this is what I think will define the next phase of this entire story, is what happens when the courts keep ruling this way, and the political pressure to comply with those rulings intensifies. Does the system hold? That's not a rhetorical question. That's the actual open question sitting underneath every single one of these rulings. I'll tell you this, the slush fund situation is not over. The Virginia judge halted it, but the legal fights are ongoing. The Florida case just reopened, meaning there's a judge now actively investigating whether the court was defrauded. The Oath Keepers case means the DOJ can't simply wave away prosecutions without showing its work. These aren't endings, they're openings. And in the coming weeks, as those cases move forward, as the DOJ has to actually respond to judges demanding explanations, we're going to find out a lot more about how this was constructed in the first place. I'll be covering every development as it comes. If you want to stay on top of this one, because this is going to move fast, make sure you're subscribed and turn on notifications, because this story is not slowing down. And genuinely, I want to hear from you. Do you think the court's holding here changes anything? Or do you think this just goes to appeal and gets delayed indefinitely? Tell me below. I read these comments more than you probably think I do. See you on the next one.